518027. Three-way calls or call waiting is not allowed and may automatically disconnect this call. Did you know the person calling you now has voicemail? You can leave a message for this party by calling 520-448-3426. You will need to know the inmate's 9-digit phone ID. Thank you for using GTL.
What's good with YouTube, y'all? You know, Big Rocco with a Convict's Perspective. You already know what time it is, coming directly from the county jail as I'm smashing, dashing, shouting on through with a whole lot of energy, man. So please hit the like, subscribe, comment, do all those things to help support this channel. And hit that bell notification for future fire content. So, man, as I'm currently, going through what I'm going through as far as, doing time and getting adapted to how things have been, being away from the system for a long time, man, a lot of things, come to light. And I've been thinking about, the different changes, man. I see a lot of similarities out here in AZ with what they got going on with their politics, man, compared to things that we went through in the 90s and 80s and 2000s, man. And there's a generational change, and I'm going to get into that. The Nuestra Raza, Soldado generation versus the Soul or Norteños Soldado generation, and I think that this is kind of, to show the evolution of change and how it was back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and the ideologies and concept of having a cause for the betterment of the Raza was back then, as far as which was the push for the equal rights on the yard, to be treated equally and viewed equally, to have a table and to have a phone and have a TV, to now it's all about the money. And you see that. You see the differences between the Nuestra Raza plight and that movement and the Soldado generation today, which are both one and the same movement. We're going to talk about that. Now, as prisons have evolved, right, and the changes of a prison society, which is prison politics, it's its own community, it's its own underworld. You can recognize, like I said, several differences, even though the Nuestra Raza and the Norteños Soldado is basically the same movement. Both were guided under the umbrella of the NF. Okay, now to understand, all the different changes, you have to go through the history. From the 1970s to the early Norteños were created. Brown Bob and Colpath and Manos and Corny, right, have all been influential in the creation of the NR bonds and format. But Corny has forever been recognized as the NR forefather. Even though before the bonds and formats were even created, when the first XIV structure Norteños were there in the late 70s, it was actually NF Captain Hoble who had put an individual named Ricardo London, who was from Sacramento, also I think down south somewhere, in charge of all undercover NF members and in charge of the structure Norteños. Corny gets all the recognition, right? But a lot of people forget that it was actually Ricardo London that had a big impact on a lot of stuff, who was in charge of all the undercover NF structure, but was not even a member of the NF at that time. Hoble had put him basically in that position, and basically Hoble was the captain, was in charge of that department. Now, when the NR came out, you had Skip and DB, who were all undercover carnals, who were pushing the structure NR line. You know what I'm saying? There was an NR cat system at that time. Cat 1, you were basically a soldado. Cat 2, you were a squad leader or a teacher. And if you were a Cat 3 member, you were undercover NF. Now, by the 1990s, you had a cat system which had been deleted. Okay, in place they put the NRC, which was the Nuestra Raza Council, the Nuestra Raza Administrators, and the NRT, which was all enforced as the rank and file in Pelican Bay. So if you were on mainline and you were an NR member, the cat system was no longer there. You basically would have a channel in Pelican Bay. Now, I've always told people this, right? What people didn't realize was all those that were in rank and file, like Pizza and Lalo from Carlera, and that they were part of the NRC, and then all the NRAs and NRTs, a lot of them were undercover NF members that were basically put in those positions to oversee the movement, and all of them were basically reporting to Corny at that time. That's why Corny has always been recognized as the one that's been in charge of the NR. Even though the NR was supposed to have its own chain of command, it was still being ran by the NF. Okay? Now, at that time, that's when the 7 fundamentals came about, and the 7 phases, and the militancy, the discipline, the education, all that stuff that came about within the Norteño Plight, which was really pushed hard more in the 90s. It started in the 80s, in the 70s, But the change in the 90s, it was on a whole different level, right? The agent of true soldados behind the wall was created at that time. This was around 91, 92. That's when they added Bond 13 to the bonds at that time. As far as aiding true soldados, it was basically becoming almost mandatory. And this is where you started to have, like, you know, around that time, you had a lot of individuals that were getting validated. You know, they're getting validated. They were going to the shoe. And the NR was almost looking like its own entity, because it was. In the absence of an N member being on the lines, because there was no NF members, the NR was basically the forefront for the movement at that time, for the cause. And it was about the cause. It was about the struggle. It wasn't about money. It was more about having a place to where you plant your flag and you had a home to where other Northerners or Norteños or those that were part of the cause could go to where they didn't have to worry about being threatened or being oppressed or being dictated by a lot of Southsiders at that time that did have that agenda. A lot of them were pushing, you know, the California and the agenda at that time. You know? And there was a lot of unity. There was a lot of fighting. There was also a lot of abuses within the rank and file. Okay? There was also those that were feeling that the NR was its own entity. Okay? But at that time, the Nuestra Raza was basically at its strongest push. It was really an elite group of individuals that started to break away even from the NF at that time. You started to have chapters and colonias and regiments that were basically NR regiments. And see, therefore, a lot of NR movements were pulling away from the NF. And basically, there was even some internal conflict. Like, you guys may have started the NR, but you say you don't dictate what we do. Okay? Which caused a lot of friction. Okay? And slowly, at that time, the cause was supposed to be about honor and about struggling together and doing all these positive things. Like I said before, this is what the vendetta of the Raza Norteña was about. Whether you were a hermano or a bro or whatever, when you got to a line, that was what the NR was supposed to be about. They were supposed to be the forefront soldiers. You know, but slowly, like I said, they started to recognize that, you know, the whole, like I said, goals were to treat everybody equal. There was those that were political, you were part of the elite circle, certain education was privileged, but then all of a sudden, the NF decided to basically take that. Okay? And that's where you started to have the drastic change. The NR basically was deleted. Okay? It was basically abolished. It wasn't to be used. It was dismantled. And then in place of the Nuestra Raza movement was the Norteño movement, which was the end soul. Okay? And this had, like I said, an everlasting effect. And like I said, there's basically two generations. There's the Nuestra Raza generation, and then there's the end soul generation. One was basically its own group that was about the cause, which was about the betterment of the people, that was about, you know, establishing yards. It wasn't about how much drugs you were selling on the yard. It wasn't about how many cell phones you were bringing in. None of that shit mattered if you didn't have a table or a fucking an area to kick it in. It was about fighting to have a place to where the opposition was there and you could coexist, or there was no opposition. It wasn't easy. People who are older like myself remember that we used to have to fight for the things that we had coming. It was dead. It was war, whether we were actually in battle or if there was Cold War. There was a lot of Cold War tactics that were going on in these yards to where we were trying to get positions, you know, like, you know, plumbers' positions, you know, laundry or kitchen, to move stuff that we had to move. So then we could fill up that yard and establish it to where it was a stronghold for us. So 24/7, right, for all these years in the 80s and 90s and 2000, it was still getting good out. It was still war. But slowly, the NF had changed that. They took away the NR. The NR at that time was its own entity in some senses. Now, it wasn't supposed to be a gang or an organization, a movement. But some individuals took it upon themselves and started to twist certain things. And some people who had rank within the NR, you know, they had their own. And the justification for the things that they were doing was that every movement has to be self-supporting. And that's where the illegal rackets and that's where the street functions and all that started to play into the NR. Whereas the NF was having its own issues. You know, the indictments that happened in the early 90s in San Jose before Operation Black Widow pretty much set the tone for everything else. Because before the 90s, before those indictments, before Operation Black Widow, if you were Kalana, right, if you were NF, you were taking care of your own business. There was no NRs that were assisting, and if they were very to be on probation. You couldn't be involved in my business, okay? you have to be basically an elite soldado. Slowly that changed. The red on red policy came out, right? The push for unity amongst all Norteños came out. And that was all for control mechanism because the NF had foresight that, look at what the NR is doing, okay, we can generate income. As long as they're all under our umbrella, under our cracked whips, under our authority, and they recognize that we're the forefathers, we're the elders, then we're going to generate all the money. And it's always been about money. And that's what I see the difference between the insouls right today. That, you know, the same movement, the same cause, and the Nuestra Raza. When, you know what I'm saying? Back in the days, it was more about the people, the betterment of the Raza. Now it's about how much dope you're pushing, how much money you're bringing in. And that's the extreme change. A lot of it has to do with there's no more oppositions. There's no more threat. There's no more interference. You know, the biggest threat that we have is amongst each other, you know? Now, the salutation filter came around that time, around April 1997, which changed, you know, the NR forever. And it took about 3 to 4 years for that to really take hold because at that time, the communications, unlike now, where now you have people that have the WhatsApp or you have fucking, you know, all these different apps where you could just communicate with someone and just, you know, delete your history. You have all these encrypted sites where you can just communicate and nobody can crack based on your code. Now, as you see the difference between the NR of the 80s, the 90s, and maybe part of the 2000s, the NF had yet to be of influence within the movement. It wasn't until you see the NF start to take control, right, and be an influence, the GUN CD, the red on red policy, deleting the NR, you start to see the desires and the selfless goals of the organization, which has all been money-based. It's all about the financial aspects of it. Now you have all the hoods that are contributing, you have all the fucking different roles that are contributing. It's more about money. You know what I'm saying? I watched a lot of videos before of J-Hands, Renegade Media, when he talks. And, you know what I'm saying? Was it Soldado? But you can see the difference in his generation, which, you know, the things that they were doing, you know, when he was doing things with Bubbles and when he hit prison, the goal of the Hempes had changed. It was more about the money. It was more about generating income. I'm not saying it wasn't about the money back then, but there was a worthy fight that people were fighting for. To have an existence on these yards. Once that threat was already taken out of the equation, it came all about the money. So when I see these younger hermanos of the old generation, I see that, you know, the teachings are a little bit different. It's been always more about the money. It's been more about the 22 by now. Whereas my generation, the Ghanaians pretty much would stay away from the NR business and let the NR do what they had to do on the main line. And when it was necessary, then they did the NF. So things had pretty much changed. And so the NF that shutting down the NR needed to happen, basically, right? Because before, like I said, they were relying just on Ghanaians to make that money. And the same things were happening over and over again. So creating this change, the red on red policy, you know, so you can't take action towards another end. The unity that has to be promoted, right? The GUN CD. All this stuff was basically put in play by Fuente. Fuente's a genius, man. A lot of things he did fucked a lot of shit up, as you already know. But overall, a lot of this foresight that was put in play was based upon Fuente's vision. Fuente had the vision of everybody kicking in 25%. Fuente had the vision of people, you know, no longer fighting each other, the red on red policy, because it was all a control mechanism. You take away the NR's authority from them, now they're all under the NF. Now they all have to comply. You give the Northerners something to believe in, now they have more foot soldiers to do their bidding. You see what I'm saying? So the NR in the 90s, right? The NFC abilities in the Soldado, so we started to recruit them to produce. It's all been about money. That's been the main focal point of all this stuff, right? And the NR at that time, like I said, was a movement of elite soldados. When you were an NR member back in the 90s, on the 6 yard, there's now to this day that are getting recruited now, right? That are pretty much watered down. They don't have the adventure. They don't have the indoctrination. They don't have the foresight. All they've been built on is to produce money. But back then, the soldados that were being bred, that were being fucking molded, were soldados that were ready to fucking lay down their lives. I mean, were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. They were ready to kill on both sides. That's how much of an elite presence the NR was felt in the 80s, in the 90s. In the 90s, they basically hit their fucking prime. And that was all tripping. Why? The NF wanted full control of the Soldado movement. You know, and now that's when you start seeing the stuff that was taught to us back in the 80s and 90s. We used to be taught that we were against oppression, we were against taxing, we were against all that. Now that stuff is not even being schooled to youngsters. They're all being schooled about making money, about selling dope, about how to create racket, about how to get in contact and establish banks. Whereas years before, we were told that we were against taxes. We were against all this stuff. So basically, everything that was taught to us is the same stuff that we were supposed to stand against, is the same stuff that's being done to us today. You know, and like I said, I try to look at the pros and cons of it, man. It is what it is. You know, the prison environments have changed, they've evolved. Therefore, you know what I'm saying, you're going to have to change this road. You're going to have to get with the time. But it's unfortunate, man, that there's been a lot of people, right, that were there in the 80s, in the 90s, when things first started, that were real competent, qualified soldados that were ready to make sacrifices. And now things have pretty much been watered down. You know, it's the money. It's all been about the money. I mean, the coexisting with opposition, the coexisting with traditional enemies. I mean, there was a time period when that wasn't supposed to happen. And even when we were coexisting, it was still a secret war. It was a Cold War that was going on. You know, but now everybody's been molded into a different way of living. And that's the biggest thing that I see between the NR, Soldado, right, the Nuestra Raza, which you can basically go from maybe like the late 70s to all the way to maybe 2001, because, like I said, when the filters came out in 97, it took a couple of years for people to, you know, catch up with the new changes, right? But look what happened when those changes started to happen. There was a time in the 80s and 90s when you wouldn't talk about the NF. You wouldn't mention the NF. Now people are openly talking about them. Like, you know, back then you used to fear it. It was something that you just didn't, it was taboo to even talk about. And they used to take care of your own shit. But like I said, all these changes, you know, the different generation, the Soldados have been pretty much taught to be inferior to the NF, right? Which was always the case, but at least back in the 80s and 90s when the NR was pushing it blind, you know, you could at least give people the incentive that they were equal. Nowadays, it's, well, I'm gonna do whatever I want to do. That's the whole mindset. And so you got a lot of individuals that are being made, right? They haven't earned it. They don't have the merit. They don't have the qualifications, man. You know, that's why the struggle that's been going on for like the last 22 years has been going on. You have one that has quality. You have one that wants quantity. The one that wants quantity is more focused on the money that comes in, and they don't care how it comes in. All money is not good money. And as you've seen both the movement evolve, the thing is whether you were part of the Nuestra Raza original movement from like 84 or 82, you can even go back to even the late 70s to 97, when you're part of the Soldado movement today, they're both the same movement, but there's a generation gap in change of how they've evolved. With that said, this is your boy Flacco from a comics perspective. I'm out.